Okay, and hello and welcome from Macau, and welcome everyone to join this webinar arranged by the Fortuna Society. And today we are honored to have Professor Indrajit Parmar from City University of London to share his insights about Anglo-American relations after Brexit. And I'm your moderator, Davis, who I'm currently based in Macau, and I study diplomacy and international studies as so as University of London. Professor Parmar is currently also a visiting professor at the LSE, which is one of his alma maters. And as distinguished scholar, he has a wide range of research interests, mainly focusing on history, politics, and sociology of Anglo-American foreign policy elites. And he's also a former chair and president of the British International Studies Association. And so how will the ties or relations between America and Britain in this time of great uncertainty, shall we say, when we have already experienced several years of Trump administration and the long, painful, difficult process of Brexit, and what will be the implications of their relations to the wider world order. So, Professor Parmar, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Davis, and to Ume as well for this kind invitation. As I was saying to them earlier, it's been very interesting for me to prepare this talk because it has helped me to think more clearly, particularly on the theoretical components of my own work. So I'm very appreciative of this opportunity that you've provided. It's a pleasure to always to have to share my work also, and also of course I'm very interested in any questions and comments and suggestions that colleagues who are listening may have as well. So as David said, my talk is entitled broadly, The Future of US-UK Relations After Brexit. And I guess it's one of the major issues of our time. Amid a time of great confusion in the world, a great amount of change and transition, and that not at the international level, but also at the domestic level, that most societies today, right across the world, regardless of the system or regime type, are undergoing some kind of a legitimacy crisis, or a crisis of order, or a crisis of confidence. And this has been exacerbated to a very high degree by the way in which the global pandemic has affected different governmental and economic and political systems, and particularly in the United States and in Britain. Alongside that, there's the kind of broader worries of what's been going on as global power shifts further to the east, and the fear or the anxiety about the eclipsing of the West itself, particularly because of what is called the rise of China, or the re-emergence of China, but also other non-Western powers too. And there has been also, amidst all this, a kind of general feeling of decline or a democratic deficit in Britain and the United States, and more broadly in Western societies as well. And I guess in a sense then, that sense of change, crisis, anxiety at home has impacted the very international system to which the US and the UK have been attached in the liberal international order since 1945. And they are the architects of that order. And they, during the Second World War and after, helped to effectively make that order. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so, in a way, the emergence of Trump and possibly Trumpism and of this idea of global Britain after Brexit are effectively the results, are interesting in the context that the two main architects of that international order in which their alliance is embedded are now in a sense of trying to loosen their relationships with that particular order as well. So what I want to do today is I want to sort of make my lectures divided into three parts. The first one is I just want to kind of lay out my argument in very brief terms, straight up, as like a big picture of what I think and are the main factors and where this may be going. Then I want to look at very briefly at a debate on the nature of the Anglo-American relationship, but also the relationship of that to the international order as well, because they're both embedded in that order. And thirdly, what I'd like to do is to illuminate and illustrate the sort of the big picture that I lay out very briefly at the beginning, and then end with some sort of empirical and theoretical conclusions or implications of what I've been saying. So very briefly, four big picture points, I think, and then I'll sort of illustrate them a little bit more in detail a little later. But the four big points I would want to make in this lecture are these. First of all, I think the Anglo-American relationship is a fundamental relationship. It has been at the core of world order for at least 2 centuries now. It is enduring, it is deep, it's widespread, and it's not going to go anywhere very quickly. Doesn't mean to say that there's unity on all fronts and so on. There will be friction, and there has been friction, but overall, this is a strong, enduring relationship. That everybody knows. The second sub-point of this first point is that actually we have to see that relationship in a global context. We cannot see it just as Britain and the United States, first of all, because it's embedded in the English-speaking states' relationships with one another. And secondly, it's embedded in an international system, which includes the post-colonial world as well. So we want to see this relationship not as only bilateral, but multilateral and global as well. That's the first point. And I think that has big implications for how we understand the world today. The second thing is that they share world views in a number of different ways, a strategic idea about how world power should work, how global power and hegemony, Anglo-American hegemony, should work. And that is this idea that sea power is the key to global power. Who controls the sea controls the world. And that is challenged today by the fact that one or two emerging powers are land-based far more than they are sea-based, and that land bridge from China to Western Europe, for example, through the Belt and Road Initiative, could well be one which undermines that idea of sea power. At the same time, the BRI offers a massive opportunity. So it is a kind of tactical advantage, but a strategic challenge as well. That's the second key point. The third point I would say is that in the post-Cold War period, you have two key processes which actually lead us to our current kind of position. And that is that globalization creates a system of winners and losers right across the world. And the second thing is that the replacement of the containment thesis after the collapse of communism leads to a promotion of democracy, which then leads to regime change wars, which undermines legitimacy on two fronts. One, those wars are unpopular, and two, those wars, the inequality that results from globalization, I would argue, diminishes the legitimacy domestically of Western regimes in particular, and in particular the Anglo-American regimes. And I'd say those two things lead directly to America first and to this idea of global, post-Brexit global Britain. The fourth thing I want to illuminate is, what does this all mean and where is it all going? How is it to be explained? And so in that regard, there are a number of different theoretical frameworks which purport to explain this whole process. There are realists who focus on power politics. There are liberal internationalists who argue about a kind of a win-win international system of institutions and so on and so forth. But I would like to put forward a third perspective, which I think better explains this system. And that, I would argue, is a kind of combination of the hegemony theories of Antonio Gramsci and the ideas about ultra-imperialism of a late 19th century, early 20th century Marxist theorist, Karl Kautsky. And I think what I think the world is heading towards is a kind of a loosening of the liberal international order, a sort of recognition grudgingly of the emerging powers like China, Brazil, India, and others in what might be called a messy multipolarity in which there's going to be turbulence, friction, as well as interdependencies, and that tension between interdependence and competition, some of it which may be quite conflictual, is what is going to cause a degree of turbulence in the world system, but which I think will lead to eventually a global compact in which different regime types can live together, but maybe engage, selectively engage in certain ways on security fronts, selectively engage in certain ways on technological fronts, economic, financial, trading, and other. But that this will not necessarily be um, kind of lead to what realists may argue is a kind of inter-hegemonic warfare. So they're the kind of four sort of big points that I just wanted to kind of belt out so that you get a picture of where I'm coming from and where I may be going. I want to start with the fourth point in a way to suggest that to look at some of the kind of rival explanations, because I think without a theoretical framing, we can just end up following a lot of empirical evidence in different directions. And I think the theoretical framings give us certain lenses through which to see how the world is changing and different ways of explaining that change, and then comparing what each perspective might help us to understand and to see which one may be the best one for the time being. The difficulty with theory is that theories are generally abstract. The world is real and it's moving and changing very, very quickly. So it's very difficult to do theoretical academic analysis in real time. And so if in a couple of years you find me wrong, I guess I'm holding my hands up and not speaking the truth, but I'm just telling you the truth as I see it at the moment. But these rival theories, so I'm just going to look at two big ones. The first one is the theory of the system of Anglo-American cooperation and of the liberal international order itself, basically liberal internationalism. And for liberal internationalism, there's a big progressive step after 1945 into creating a post-colonial, post-imperial international system of institutions and rules, of the rule of law, and of representative institutions too, like the United Nations, but the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods system, and embedding in that system a system of rule of law, of kind of recognizing sovereignty of rich and poor states, black and white states, first world, third world, and so on, for the first time on an equal footing, or formally at least on an equal footing. And that at the core of this system, if you like, was Anglo-American power. And that Anglo-American power, if you like, with two liberal societies, liberal democracies, sea-based, uh, internationally kind of international outlooks, was the kind of source upon which the world system was built after the colonial, effectively the colonial period. And this is a progressive big step forward compared with the previous system of blocks, of rivalries, economic protectionism, and then of course we know that it led to a Great Depression, but also it was a symptom of the Great Depression, it led to Greater Depression, and it also led to the Second World War. And so the liberal internationalists argue that this is a big step forward, and within this system, the Anglo-Americans have a kind of more privileged position, but they are also bound by the rules of the hegemonic order. So this is the first time in a way, people like Eikenberry and others argue that a hegemonic power like America has allowed itself to be bound by the rules of the system that it has established, even if it has some privileges which it exercises from time to time. But it's a kind of win-win mutual gain. And the benefit of that system has been, they would argue, there's been a long peace, that there's no war in Europe and North America since 1945, that basically after two world wars in the 20th century, this system established a set of institutions and relationships, a kind of international community, which with shared norms in which you could discuss and argue and ease frictions and that kind of thing. And the European project was also a key part of that. Now, against that particular view, I would posit a kind of a neo-Gramscian view of the liberal international order. And I would argue that rather than this being a kind of set of equal relationships or broadly equal relationships, actually mostly this was the core of the world order, the core metropolitan states, which had themselves come out of empire, colonialism, and imperialism. And although they had fought this anti-racist war against the Nazis and so on, and against race theory, and embedded non-racism or anti-racism into the international system, the system they did create of the IMF, World Bank, and NATO and so on was effectively representing far more their interest, elitist, imperial, kind of hierarchical and racialized. That although it provided an open door in many respects to previously unrepresented peoples and states and regions, it remained hierarchical in the way in which it was operated, because the greater power and say in that system rested with the Anglo-Americans and their broader kind of metropolitan core state allies. So that effectively what you have is at the top of those core powers are powerful ruling elites. And those ruling elites have alliances between them and among them. And they, in effect, are the biggest beneficiaries in terms of power, privilege, wealth, income, and so on from that system too. That is to say that the core states are also class systems, systems of unequal power and privilege, wealth and income, and so on. And that's the main beneficiaries of those systems are the relatively small numbers of people at the very top of those, even if there are welfare systems for greater level of transfers and wealth income distributions and so on. But I would argue that later on with globalization, that exacerbates and it is a source of a big crisis in Anglo-American power and in the international system itself. And what I suggest is then that the relationship between Britain and the United States, and to some extent also between the English-speaking powers, more generally, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and also South Africa, for example, that there is actually a set of elite networks which conjoin these ruling elites in the English-speaking world, which then creates a sort of deeper, more enduring set of relationships, which are more than just, they're underpinned by a particular liberal imperial worldview, an internationalized liberal imperial worldview, but also underpinned by racial and ethnic identities, by language, and which makes them much more than just interstate relations. I would argue that they are more like imagined communities, more than states, more than nations. And that has a big effect on the kind of future trajectory of these particular set of relationships. Where Karl Kautsky's work comes in is really, he internationalizes, I think, Gramsci's ideas of hegemony. So that in Gramsci, you have these kind of hegemonic blocks, historic blocks of elites and some masses who effectively have a governing concept to dominate a particular society, have hegemony in a particular time. What Kautsky argues is that if you have a whole range of states, imperial states, which have these historic blocks and kind of powerful elites, they don't necessarily have to go to war with each other. They can actually have a lot of shared interests so that they form elite networks, in which they discuss, argue, and share large amounts of interests and strategies, etc. And therefore they underpin those international institutions. In effect, they internationalize their system. They diminish the level of conflict, and they allow those ruling elites right across that system to be able to more successfully collaborate in the domination of the world and the exploitation of those who are at the bottom of that hierarchy in the world system as well. That is effectively like it's a collective colonial neo-colonialism rather than what is called internationalism. It is on an international basis, but it's an extractive, exploitative, and dominating kind of relationship. So that is that system, if you like, with all its contradictions and tensions, because if you exclude certain people from the benefits of that system, then eventually at some point, those kind of embedded rivalries and tensions and resentments are going to resurface because countries change, economies change, states change, they become more or less powerful in relation to one another. And that then creates greater levels of tension because the balance of power and the balance of forces shifts in the world. And then that creates powerful movements for reform and change and so on, which is what I would argue that we are experiencing at the international level to one extent or another at the moment. So I would argue that we can explain the world as we go forward in terms of Anglo-American relations, as well as, if you like, even relations with rising powers through this kind of Gramscian Kautskian. And the prediction, I guess, of that theoretical frame is to suggest that while there are tensions, actually there's a far higher and more powerful level of interdependencies which will mitigate those tensions, but that the mechanisms will need to arise which enable the that that set of powers to manage their discontent. There's somebody from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace recently called it the relationship between, for example, China and the West, or China and the United States. They called it managed enmity. And I think it's more than that. I think it's enmity, to some extent, rivalry and competition, but it's also interdependency and cooperation on big global issues, but also financial and economic issues as well. So I think that's, I'll talk a little bit more about that right at the conclusion, but that's the kind of two frameworks theoretically that I think that I'm trying to discussing here. So when we look at this, these 4 points, there's 4 parts of this argument. Yes, I would argue that the Anglo-American and the English-speaking world relationship is a fundamental relationship. It's based on strong interdependencies since 1945, but also faces a global dilemma, a dilemma of a challenger state, if you like, to some extent, which is offering vast opportunities for economic growth and well-being, but at the same time is feared because it is amassing greater levels and potentially greater levels of geopolitical power, strategic power, and military power. And that is going to shift the balance of power in the world itself. But as I argued, Anglo-American relations have always been embedded in a global system. They can't be seen only in bilateral kinds of terms. And they were a step forward in a big way from the 1930s, the Second World War, and so on. It opened up, it created a space, even if it was flawed. The fact is that states could go to the United Nations, for example, they can, and they can raise their grievances, they can form committees, they can form alliances, they can create a global movement for change. And I would argue later on that this forum and other forums which developed enabled that. So for example, in the 1950s, by the mid-50s, you have the Bandung Conference, and the Bandung Conference gathers together the kind of non-aligned movement later on, which, if you like, is between the superpowers. But even framing it like between the superpowers suggests that all they do is try to avoid the Soviets and the West. But actually, they're also fashioning their own idea about who they are, what they stand for, and what initiatives they're going to take in the world. What is their culture of diplomacy and cooperation? And how are they going to manage their sovereignties and also promote their power in the world, so that they are effectively a factor in the way in which the Western powers themselves interrelate to each other, because the Western powers are fundamentally interdependent with those powers too. Because when you look at global flows of people, of money, of ideas, of raw materials, markets, investments, and financial connections, the world is actually much more unified than the kind of state system would suggest. That is to say, all of this wealth and so on flows around, and therefore that globe needs management. And therefore, the relationship between the United States and Britain as leading powers has to involve the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is deeply integrated with them. And what happens in one part of the world, for example, Korea, has effects on Western Europe too. It's not just a sideshow war in 1950 to 53 and so on. So there is a kind of sense of interdependence of the whole world in which is embedded this Anglo-American kind of alliance. But as I said, that Anglo-American alliance is very Anglo. It is very Western, and it's hierarchical and so on. But it's cemented together sufficiently because of the Cold War, the so-called Soviet threat. And so the institutions like NATO and the European Union, or the common market, the European community, later on the European Union, the European project, kind of are built in order to galvanize and bolster that particular kind of a metropolitan unity. And a global alliance system is built in the wake of the Korean War too. SEATO, CENTO, and others, all working at different levels. There's a hub and spoke system for East Asia, for example, with Japan and South Korea and other countries. But there is a set of sort of, if you like, international arrangements, which are very, very powerful. But it is hierarchical. And But as I said, over time, 20 years later, after 45 into the mid 60s, Japan isn't what it was 20 years earlier. West Germany isn't what it was 20 years earlier. And they then demand a position in the world and a say in the world commensurate to their power. But also, those post-colonial states are not what they used to be either. They're far more significant on the world stage. And the demands in the 1970s from the G77 for the new international economic order and so on, force the West to sort of try to kind of manage those particular powers and try to integrate them a lot more. And what I would argue is that what occurs because of that is effectively what happens later is the development of the BRICS, because some third world powers are seen as aspiring middle class powers, and they're increasingly integrated into the system. Still, hierarchically below the, the Western core metropolitan powers and their East Asian allies, but nevertheless in a position now to benefit much more overtly. But there's their elites which are largely benefiting. And that's what I would argue is the kind of part of the reason why we have the BRICS today and that level of international competition today. Because the elites in those countries were able to open up their economies and thereby benefit uh, from them, increase their power, their economic power, and so on, but at the same time, then constitute challenges later on. So, what was a sort of a fix in the 1970s to manage demands for a new international economic order by incorporating these powers was also the basis of a longer term challenge to these powers, because once those powers were able to take advantage of the opportunities made available by those powers themselves, they were going to come and compete with the West, and not just economically, but maybe diplomatically, and demand seats in the UN Security Council, reform, and so on and so forth at the IMF and the World Bank and elsewhere. So the core powers, if you like, have important interests, but they're not identical interests. And of course, the US replaced the UK as the kind of global hegemon. And Britain, you cannot say, was happy about that. And what happened at Suez and after was a cause of great trauma. But at the same time, the two were locked together because Britain basically had nowhere else to go. They were reliant on the US because the US had a vision of sea power and of an international order and a system within which Britain now was going to be an increasingly junior partner, but remained embedded in it. A key power in NATO, a key power at the United Nations Security Council, a key power represented on the Bretton Woods institutions, and a major economy in the world with the City of London as a kind of global hub for and so on. Secondary to New York to a degree, but nevertheless still a kind of global power. And also, the British Empire didn't just go away. They still had the real estate all around the world for the air, naval, and military bases, which the US wanted to take over through a gradual suicide of the UK power. So, but the key thing now is that they share this idea about sea power and supremacy through dominating the seas, but it's increasingly challenged by the rise of China and the Belt and Road Initiative in particular, and in particular the Eurasian landmass. But what the Anglo-Americans have done over the past several centuries is seen off anybody who tried to dominate the Eurasian landmass. The King of Spain, Napoleon, uh, Hitler, Stalin, who tried in some way or other, and the Sino-Soviet split, for example, was a key kind of engineered move in order to try to keep that Eurasian landmass divided. Because as long as you travel by sea and you trade by sea, then sanctions control. If you control the choke points of the Straits of Malacca or the Gulf, you control a great deal of global commerce, and you can then apply blockades, embargoes, sanctions, and so on, and maintain your kind of level of power to police the world in that kind of way. It's very difficult if somebody's now developed high-tech means of transporting freight and people and everything else, and all that infrastructure, and then the whole economic development along that entire corridor, which then challenges your whole geopolitical vision for the world. And I think that is a key thing, which, if you like, is a dilemma for the Anglo-Americans. It's a dilemma because, one, it's a challenge to the sea power and their kind of existing authority and power in the world, but it's also a huge dilemma because it's also an opportunity. They want in to the Belt and Road Initiative. They want transparency for the way in which contracts are divvied up and dished out. They want to know, how do we make bids? And many, many big American and other companies have made billions of dollars actually already out of contracts with the Belt and Road Initiative. So the third kind of point was about the post-Cold War system. And I think this is where the kind of the global setup and the domestic legitimacy crisis meets together. And there, where I would argue, is that the twin forces of globalization opened up the world's countries, economies, and cultures, and in effect created a set of winners and losers in the world as well. There are lots of people who gained a lot out of it. A lot of people lifted out of poverty and so on. But a very large number of people in a large number of countries, including the metropolitan countries, have not benefited from it. That redistribution of industry and work, which occurred from the 1970s because of the new international economic order, as well as automation and technological development, which redistributed work and industry to other parts of the world, has had an effect on the deindustrialization of the core Western states too. And that has created people who have just been feelings of left behind, of cultural loss, economic loss, loss of position, and so on. And that has undermined the whole globalization, liberal capitalist globalization kind of project, and has led to rise of populism and protectionism and nationalism and so on. The twin of that was, if you like, the replacement of the containment thesis and containment strategy by democratic peace theory. That there was no red threat anymore to be contained. What there was a chance now to sort of have no barriers effectively to democratic market-based societies. And so democracy promotion through democratic peace theory becomes the central strategic concept, particularly of the United States in the 1990s. So Clinton's administration, democratic enlargement, second administration, democratic engagement, was all around democracy promotion. And the neoconservatives and other forces championed democracy promotion as a way of getting rid of tyrannical and dictatorial regimes. And a lot of the Iraq war post 9/11 kind of rationalizations were related to that kind of democratize. Iraq is Germany. Iraq is the Germany from 1945. You democratize that, you democratize the region and so on. You create more peaceful societies, and therefore you have commerce and so on and so forth. But these regime change wars and other means of kind of regime destabilization, actually deeply unpopular, created extra problems of refugee crises and state failures and so on, but also eroded the popular legitimacy of the Western core metropolitan regimes, the Anglo-Americans in particular. So when you've got globalization chipping away at your economic and cultural positions, and then you've got these wars chipping away, if you like, at other aspects of your kind of belief in the elites which are leading, and you add that to the financial crisis of 2008, you've got the basis upon which the kind of very legitimacy of your system is going to be questioned at home. But all that while, you've also been creating the basis of your challenges internationally, that you've created this system in which some other states, new states, emerging powers have got more and more wealthy, more rich, more challenging, more competitive, and they are effectively able to challenge your positions in markets and so on and so forth. And there's a greater anxiety about what that might lead to later on. So in effect, these twin tendencies ramp up nationalism. They reflect that decline of popular legitimacy. They lead to a kind of diminishing attachment to the liberal international order, which people blame for delivering this kind of effects on them at home. It talks up the China threat, for example, in racialized and economic and strategic and security terms. And I argue it creates the basis upon which America First effectively becomes viable or possible, and Global Britain and Brexit and others, that this whole project, if you like, has led to more problems than it has to solutions. Nevertheless, you have this kind of big shift and flux and change, but nevertheless, there are huge global interdependencies too. So when we look at all that, where do we see Anglo-American power kind of going? And my argument is that the whole world system is being loosened up, and the positions of different states and economies in that system is changing. And if you like, it's a bit like somebody at the one end of a rope just pulling that rope, and that kind of wave goes across that rope. And I think we're in that kind of multiple ropes being shaken at the same time. And there is no settling at the moment. But what I could say is two things. One is related to Anglo-American relations, and the second is, and I would argue the Gramscian-Kautsky argument plays well there, and the second is in relation to the Anglo-Americans and China, which I think is the biggest strategic issue as we go forward as well. And I would argue a Gramscian-Kautsky argument plays well there too. And so what I would say is that the Anglo-Americans are unified by this sense of an imagined community as much as they are by just being sort of states in alliance with one another. That their relationships are beyond any particular issue of competition or cooperation. You can't sort of judge them on specific issues where there's something about Huawei and they disagree with one another, or something about, you know, whatever it might be. Well, there's lots of issues. The Iran nuclear agreement, for example, things like that. Yes, there are frictions, but they're not actually be all and end all. They're not kind of defining moments in a relationship. They are parts of what happens in relationships, which are very close, in which people have disagreements. So what I would argue is that there's far greater, which is interconnecting those systems, those networks, which are very powerful, those interests and those governing concepts. And I would argue that goes all the way back to 1945, 1950, and Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, and President Truman, and the way in which they saw the melting pot of America as the open society into which all racial countries in the world will be kind of welcome and integrated into this international system, and Britain morphing the empire into Commonwealth, which is the first multiracial international organization. Again, an Anglo-Saxonism of hierarchy, of incorporation, integration, and assimilation of others, in contrast to Herrenvolk theory that the Nazis put forward, which is cast iron racial difference, whereas Anglo-Saxonism was seen as cultural. And if it's cultural, it is you can up culture peoples through foreign aid and that kind of thing, through development strategies, etc. So in effect, you've got this kind of model between embedding the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American, and those other kind of English-speaking powers in a broad sense. And the work of Tim Legrand shows, if you like, in very concrete terms, how the Anglosphere, if you like, how deeply it kind of embedded and unified in so many interesting ways that it's not just a kind of a community of the imagination. That imagination is actually rooted in daily interactions at a very wide and deep level. So Tim Legrand's research shows that there are more than 30 networks on a whole range of issues across the English-speaking world, the Anglospheric kind of community in the world, with the Anglo-Americans at the core, which are underpinned, which are official and unofficial. They're underpinned by identity dynamics, a kind of racial ethnic community of identity, which sort of has a united idea about various kind of global threats to that kind of position. So one of those is, obviously we've all heard of, is the Five Eyes, the kind of intelligence system, shared intelligence between the five big Anglo-American powers. And that obviously works in terms of policy networks and policy ideas with high-level policymakers elected as well as appointed and so on. But there are lots of other kind of networks right across the areas of social policy, to education, to welfare, to cybersecurity, digitization, borders, industry, and all based on these kind of memoranda of understandings, not binding agreements, but kind of tacit agreements about what is a good thing and to kind of collaborate with and try to achieve. But there's a lot of other five sort of systems of five power cooperation as well. There's a quintet of attorneys general. There's the 5 country conferences since 2008. There's a migration 5. There's a border five. There's a 5-country ministerial, which was held in 2013 to discuss national security, for example. There's an aviation five, a critical infrastructure five. That is to say, there's a lot of high fives going on amongst these powers, which are basically not just imagined, they're real. These are real people meeting in real time to discuss real problems and share ideas, share arrangements, and collaborate and cooperate with each other. And effectively, they are a power in the world, which is often not very often seen. They are less visible. They're below the radar of a lot of international relations and international politics research, but they are very, very real. And they've taken a long, long time to build. And so what does this say? This suggests that that Anglo-American relationship is very deep, very powerful, and it's embedded in all sorts of sense of community, a sense of racial and ethnic identity, as well as institutions and security and other kinds of relationships. It is not going anywhere. It will face uh, disagreements. They won't always agree with each other, but I don't think things are going to change very, very greatly. And in regard to China, for example, so if they're embedded with each other, these ruling elites and their alliances and networks and movements and concepts, which maintains them, if you like, in a broad front, then I think the kind of Gramscian, Kautskian argument suggests not that these relationships are going to break down, but it's going to suggest that there will be tension even among people with a shared culture, history, language, and sort of ideals and so on, you know, the Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, and all that kind of liberal heritage. But with China, India, Brazil, and others have actually come to where they are today, not entirely by their own bootstraps, if you like, but embedded in this international system, reformed in the 1970s because of the demands of the new international economic order. That is, they've grown up to be where they are as a result of this international system, but they become very, very powerful. And so they are going to challenge. At the same time, they're deeply embedded in economic, financial, and other relationships with the Anglosphere countries and other countries as well. And you cannot just wish China away because China is a key power in the global economy. And with the pandemic and the effects of that, its strategic power is even greater because it's a key to global recovery. Its growth in the last quarter has meant that China is now back where it was last year in 2019 economically. That means it's a great magnet for goods and services and so on and so forth. And that is going to generate greater levels of economic activity, etc. It's a security challenge, but an economic opportunity. So what Kautsky would argue is, yeah, if you look at China, for example, and its development from the 1978, 79 onwards, the Great Opening, large numbers of Western institutions, particularly American institutions, Ford Foundation, American Economics Association, the World Bank, helped to integrate China, develop free market economics as a discipline, uh, set up new think tanks to think about new ways of economic planning and economic growth and so on, as well as policy reforms. So you've got a great deal of interdependence. So it's going to be, so if Britain being replaced by the US with having so much shared led to trauma for Britain in particular, because it got replaced, if you like, as the hegemon, then a country and a culture which doesn't share the same history with the Anglo-Americans, the integration of that and the relationship between that as it rises, they're not going to be smooth either. So what I would argue is that the Anglo-American relationship is going to continue to be very, very powerful. It is going to suffer some frictions. It is going to be broadly unified as well. And I think the world is going to now go into a phase in which there's a sort of messy multipolarity where there are new poles of power, none which is necessarily dominant, but they're going to have to come to some sort of an arrangement on a selective level on security, economy, and finance, and at international levels to try to live with one another in a way which does not lead to any kind of eruption of broad conflict between great powers. And I think I'll stop there because I've probably used up all my time,
No,
but
it's perfect.
I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions and I'm happy to take them.
Yeah, and of course, and thank you, Professor Pamal. Thank you for your fascinating sharing. And yes, and we welcome questions from everyone from our audience. But I would first want to, and you can tap your questions on Zoom, or you can ask to speak. But I would have some observations. Would like to share with Professor Palmer is that what you say is really real that we should not overestimate the frictions between US and UK. But what I have been seeing is from my reading of Chinese media reportage in mainland China, some media would try to portray since the inception of Trump administration seems to it seems to me that they are sort of over presenting the frictions while neglecting or ignoring what you say their deep ties under radar. I think that in long term, if this I would say wrong image continue to be projected, that would lead to some miscalculation which can rise to policy level, which will have a real meaningful impact on international relations. But my question is that on cultural hegemony, because if the UK and US and other English-speaking country is a cultural alliance more than a racial alliance, I guess culture itself is more inclusive. And would you think that in face of other emerging powers, like including India, which is also somehow English speaking, right? Do you think the cultural hegemony represented by US and UK would somehow need to slightly adjust their own culture in order to maintain their cultural hegemony? Because after all, they cannot ignore other English-speaking countries. And we know that English-speaking countries are by no means only about Five Eyes. Do you think that they need to adjust their own culture or their alliance in order to also accommodate other English-speaking countries, such as India?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably more than just other English-speaking countries. I think it's one of the big difficulties, of course, is that there is there's a power shift kind of going on, and there's a kind of anxiety that the position the West has occupied for 400 or 500 years is going to have to be shared with a lot more people
Mm.
across the world, and they're mainly non-Western states. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that is going to require quite a large cultural adjustment. Um, it's interesting when the head of the policy planning staff in the State Department, uh, Dr. Chiron Skinner, last year sometime, I think she said that China represents today a different kind of challenge to, to the West compared with any other challenge previously, including the Soviet challenge. And that is, it's a non-Caucasian power. And I think that kind of racialized mentality is all too evident still. So I think it may, in the long run, take a very long time for that kind of a cultural or ethno-racial adjustment to be able to uh, effectively have anything approaching the sort of relationship that the Anglo-sphere countries have among them and between them. Um, the only thing I could say is there's a factor for change which is accelerating. It's two things. One is the power of those non-Western states and cultures. The second is that most of the Anglo-sphere countries are multicultural societies.
Yeah.
They're broadly cosmopolitan societies, such that the concept of who is an Australian, who is a New Zealander, who is a Canadian, who is an
London,
American,
just say
right?
London.
Right? Who is a Briton? It changes. When you look at the British government today, you have many people in very senior positions who are not white English or white British and so on. So there are these kind of factors at work which are then therefore likely to help adjust and moderate those kinds of tendencies and try to build those stronger relationships. Sure. So I think that is the key thing about the cultural character of that hierarchy, that it wasn't a closed door. And this is where I think Clement Attlee, in a very famous speech in 1944 at the London American Society, on Thanksgiving Day in November 44, he argued the distinction between racial theory of the Nazis of Herrenvolk, which was white superiority, and everybody else is subordinated, to one where Anglo-Saxonism was a melting pot. It welcomed new powers like into the Commonwealth and so on, and new peoples. But it just said is it's going to take some of them time to achieve our level, right? So if in some ways that evolution over a long period of time has been taking place, and I think that is the kind of thing that is likely to continue to underpin some of the big shifts in mentalities, which are going to have to kind of happen in order for sort of greater levels of international cooperation.
Okay, and Emma would want to also have questions for you, Professor. Please, Emma.
Thank you. It's Emma Bryant here. I'm from Bard College in New York. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much. I've been thinking about these issues quite a lot, and I wondered if you could comment a little on what this means with respect to the balance of democratic states versus authoritarian states, and things like, questions that I think are on the back of our minds, maybe the front of our minds, all of us, about whether this is changing the balance of this in the future. Worries I have, I see, authoritarian tendencies rising in the West, and we are also considering how our digital world will move in the future, and looking at China and its use of technology for social control and so forth. Is the West just going to have to accept a rebalancing when it comes to the dominance of, democratic power in the world? We maybe want more like equality and less sort of, domination of other powers by the West, but does that mean that we need to accept authoritarianism and the human rights abuses that we see? Can we challenge this into the future? What are your thoughts on this? Thank you.
It's a really big question. I'll do my best in the time I have. I think first thing is I would point out the ambiguity at the best, the ambiguity of the relationship between the West and democracy and authoritarianism. Western states, coming out of imperial relationships, very often engineered authoritarian and dictatorship kind of regimes around the world when they went against Western interests. That's historical. Today, we see very strong relationships between several repressive states which violate human rights and the United States, Britain, and other countries too. Look at Saudi Arabia. There are many places in which torture and other things happen. So I would not say paint an easy picture of West democratic human rights, rule of law, rest authoritarian, repressive, and so on. I think it's a much muddier picture. Second thing is, if you genuinely believe in the right of nations to self-determination, which is what is lauded at the United Nations and so on, then the internal regime of a state is the job of the people of those countries themselves, that they are the ones who should decide what is their fate. What happened in Iraq when the West, or Britain, America in particular, decided that they didn't like Saddam Hussein anymore because he wasn't fighting Iran. He was more of an independent power in the Middle East and was doing his own thing, and he sat on the fourth largest oil reserves in the world and so on. So that regime change didn't inaugurate a kind of brand new sort of equivalent of Germany. So my own view is that you have to have relations with all kinds of states, but there are tolerances and limits. And if states sign up to agreements about torture, about human rights and so on, then there are forums in the world in which those issues should be raised and representations made. But you know as well as I do, you can say one thing to a weak state and have sanctions on them and do all kinds of things, but you can't say much to China. Who forces sanctions on the United States? You know,
Yeah.
in the 1960s, Malcolm X went to the United Nations and said, look at what is going on. Look at the racial violence going on in the US. People are getting lynched in the South. This is an international problem. Now, you know, who's going to go to the United States and enforce human rights in the Deep South? So big states, big powers do what they like because they can. And yes, you can make representations, but you know what? Even with those, economic interests often trump human rights. So you look at Tiananmen Square, and then 2 or 3 years later, you're kind of integrating China into the World Trade Organization by 2001, and most favored nation clauses, etc. So, you know, I think international politics is not the place in which you can look at consistent application of democratic, liberal, or moral principles. Every regime type is shot through with a lot of contradictions. And so, yeah, what are we left with? We're left with states which have their regimes and so on. And the key thing is, how do we maintain peaceful, prosperous relations, which minimize domestic discontent, which often then is used to create a nationalist, populist demand for greater, you know, kind of a xenophobia, which then can create international tensions like we're seeing at the moment. And so that's where I would stand. I would say let's take seriously the principle of the right of nations to self-determination.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
and my observation is like, especially since the beginning of this pandemic, we hardly heard any mentioning of like America's political leaders speak of America's mission to spread like a democracy and liberty, and it's not mentioned at all. Like, for example, during the last presidential debate, it's nothing like that at all. And but such thing may appear like back in 10 years ago, but no doubt the world has changed. And we have one final quick question, is that Professor, you mainly talk about Anglo-American powers, but also sometimes you also mention Western powers. So what's your view on the interrelations between Anglo-American powers and the rest of the Western powers? For example, in Macau, we are very familiar with countries, not necessarily the UK, but like Portugal or Spain. And that's a question from one of our audience members.
Sure. I think there are kind of, if you like, this thing called the West is obviously an imagined community too. And there are sort of, there are obviously kind of, they share a common past in a certain respect. There's certain kind of civilizational values and history, as well as a history of colonialism, broadly speaking, and then kind of neo-colonial or neo-imperialism or internationalism. So there is that kind of broad unity, to some extent held together in the Cold War in particular, for a time. I don't think there's a kind of a complete unity, because we see Germany and France clearly having different ideas about things from Britain and the United States, and then obviously with regard to the European Union. But I think there is a kind of common sort of broad Western sensibility or civilizational kind of idea. But on the other hand, there's a lot of economic opportunities in non-Western states and societies and economies. And when there are those opportunities, then the interests of your government in employment and investment and economic growth and so on is going to sort of attenuate that civilizational thing. So that's why I think it's destined in the longer run, I would think, to diminish in significance, especially as cosmopolitanism kind of increases, and the who is British, who is German, who is French, who is American, and so on. That begins to change. That identity begins to change. I think then there'll have to be some kind of sort of greater level of cooperation. The biggest worry for me is that the inequalities of class, which then overlay some of these other inequalities of class within states, they create a demand for nationalism. And that political elites then try to often harness and galvanize nationalism as a way of suggesting that it's the foreigner who's the source of your problem, when in fact it's the unequal distribution of the benefits of globalization at increasingly smaller numbers of people, smaller proportions of people. You know, people used to talk about the 10%, then they talk about the 1%, and now they're talking about the 0.1%. It's not like there's a shortage of wealth in the world. There's vast amounts of wealth, more wealth than there ever has been. But who has it? Who has access to it? And I think the management of mass discontent as a result of the hardships brought about by inequality, I think they're the sources of nationalism, populism, and therefore international tensions. Until something is done about those, I think there's some sort of democratization of ownership and control, of redistribution of income and wealth. So people who, young students and graduates who've done all the right things see a world in front of them where they don't know where they're going, but they've done everything they were supposed to do. If those people don't see a future for themselves in a big way, then I think your system has failed to work. So you need to do something about that. And that will sort of hopefully create a greater level of domestic legitimacy and stability, which then creates a basis for which you can have a kind of global compact, which enables that too. After 1945, in effect, the social welfarism domestically underwrote security at home, and the international system provided a sort of security internationally. And the two were interlocked with each other in a global compact. That global compact has just bust apart. And I think it's largely to do with the kind of globalization processes, which have gone to quite extreme levels. So mine isn't a call for kind of going back to the nation state only and being kind of locked into that, but it's creating a new global compact with its domestic counterparts, which might be much more manageable and stable. Probably a pipe dream, I would think.
Thank you, Professor Pama. And that's it for our webinar today or tonight here in Macau. And on behalf of the society, I once again thank you for joining us. And hopefully we will meet again online, and hopefully soon after the pandemic we can meet in person and to share ideas, and which can bring us together despite our differences, languages or cultures. And that's also a core mission of our society. Once again, thank you very much, and thank you for all the friends for joining us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.